Snow hammered the Wind River Range, turning 1870 Wyoming into a white maze that swallowed tracks. Elias Kane, in a ridge cabin, latched a crooked shutter and told himself the past could not climb. Then came a slight knock, quick, careful, as if the hand feared. He opened to two black twin girls, 6 years old, no taller than his rifle stock. Soaked and shaking, braids glued to their cheeks, a worn quilt dragging at their boots. One carried a brass locket on a frayed ribbon. The other clung to her sister's sleeve, eyes fixed on him. The first tried a whisper that barely crossed the threshold. "Are you Elias Kane?" He had not heard his name at a doorway in years. "We were told to find you," the second said, voice thin with cold. "By who?" "We are Lila and Nora Reed," the first added. "Our mama, Clara Reed." The name split him open. Heat rose behind his eyes. He drew them in, barred the weather, and crouched by the hearth to rub life into small hands. Steam lifted from sleeves, while the fire pulled color into pale faces. The locket clicked against his palm. Inside lay folded papers, a curl of hair, and a crest he swore never to face. The girls watched, not begging, waiting, as if one word from him could turn a road from ruin to safety. He unrolled the papers with unsteady fingers. Outside, the wind hunted the eaves. Inside, the past sat by the fire. Something he buried long ago scraped its way back. When the first line met his eyes, Elias knew why two 6-year-olds crossed a frozen range to knock on his door. What they carried would crack open a secret that could ruin every life he'd tried to protect or save them all. Dawn thinned the storm into a hush. Elias Kane woke to the stove's faint tick, fed kindling to coals, and set a kettle to boil. The cabin smelled of wool and smoke. Two small shapes lay under a buffalo robe on the bench, braids drying. He had not expected anyone at his door again, let alone children, since the war, and a choice that cost a friend. Solitude had been his shield. One midnight knock had cracked it. He checked the bar, turned back to the girls. The kettle began to sing. The room was spare. A table, 2 stools, a pallet, a shelf of jars. Above the hearth, a rifle hung as a quiet witness. On the table, a brass locket rested beside folded papers he had opened before sleep. The deed named Clara Reed as the owner of the creek and meadow east of Bitterroot. A neat note said, "Keep them safe." He could hear her voice in those words, steady and insistent, as if she stood daring him to be better. The twins stirred. Elias poured broth into tin cups, crouched, and met their eyes. "Sip slow," he said. "Warmth first, questions after." They obeyed with the care of the bone-tired. He pressed each fingertip, checked heels and toes, and wrapped warmed cloths around their feet. Angry skin. No lasting harm. The tenderness that rose surprised him. It arrived as a decision, not doubt. Whatever chased these girls to his door would not cross his threshold without a fight. "Are you Elias Kane?" Nora asked. He nodded. Lila studied his sleeve. "Mama said to find the man with a wolf on his arm." He pushed the cuff back. Faded ink shaped a wolf's head, mouth closed, eyes forward. Once that mark meant fellowship. Later, it meant the memory he had buried under timber and distance. "Clara sent you," he said, and the name loosened the heat he had banked for years. He pictured a porch, a scarfed braid, a laugh quick as flint, and a look that forgave nothing but trusted effort. Lila unclasped the locket and set it on his palm. The hinge creaked like a small door. Inside lay the deed, a curl of hair, and a pressed seal. He read again to be sure the night had not tricked him. Clara owned a parcel east of town. The twins were her heirs. If they held the land, they could eat, learn, and live without owing men who took first and asked later. He shut the locket, steadied his hands, and said, "You are safe here." He meant today and tomorrow. He cooked oats with a bit of salt and dried berries, then watched them eat as if each spoonful were a promise kept. "How far did you walk?" he asked. Lila told the path. Wagon to station, thunder spooking a mule, a man pointing at a ridge with 3 spires and saying, "Follow that line." Snow took tracks. Wind took breath, but the ridge stayed. Inside, a plan formed. Copy the deed, find a messenger, and step into town without feeding talk. A fist rapped twice, quick and certain. Margaret Holt stepped in with snow on her shawl and a healer's bag. She had careful eyes and a way of moving that steadied rooms. "Smoke this early, small prints in the yard," she said. "I brought salve and a question." She knelt by the twins. "I am Margaret. May I tend your hands?" Lila and Nora offered them without fear. She warmed salve, rubbed it over red skin, and checked their feet with brisk kindness. "Good," she said. "No harm we cannot mend." Elias passed her the deed and note. She read, then met his look. "Clara was careful," she said. "Careful matters when truth meets noise." She tapped the seal. "This must be recorded. I do not want a clerk persuaded by a loud voice to claim he never saw it. Victor Crane has men walking Main Street asking after creek parcel. They speak as if boundaries were suggestions." The name told Elias all he needed. He had seen that kind of appetite before. "If I carry this into Bitterroot he will know before I reach the square," Elias said. Margaret nodded. "Then we bring Reverend Amos Cole here. He reads the register straight and can stamp a copy without fuss. I will send a boy I trust by the ridge path. Meanwhile, make copies, hide one, keep one close." She glanced at the twins. "They should not be left even for an hour." "I will not leave them," Elias said, and the truth settled like another layer of warmth. He set the locket where his hand would brush it, shaved curls, and let his mind move. He thought about clerks and deputies, about who greeted coin and who did. He weighed the distance between neighbors. He let old shame surface without giving it a rule. A better road stood open, and he meant to walk it. Margaret brewed willow bark tea and handed out tin cups. "If anyone rides this way before Amos arrives," she said, "keep silent and let the trees do their work." She tucked a deed copy into her satchel and slid another under a loose board near the stove. "Noise follows greedy men like crows," she said. "We will keep our counts." The twins watched with steady eyes. Lila looked at the wolf again and touched her wrist as if mirroring its place. "Mama said the person with that mark would help even when scared," she murmured. "We will do what is right." Elias, he pulled the robe higher and felt them lean into the gesture with humbling trust. When Margaret left to send her message, the clearing shone like any morning, yet nothing felt the same. Elias washed bowls, wiped the table, and set the deed where sunlight could touch. He listened to the stove tick, the wind press at the eaves, and the twins breathing steady. In the quiet, a question formed like guidance. "Have you ever been given a chance to right a wrong?" Elias hadn't, until now. He let the words anchor. He taught the girls how to warm their hands without touching a flame, how to listen for hoofbeats under the wind, how to tell cabin noise from a foot on snow. Teaching steadied his mind. Each small instruction said what he could not yet say aloud. "I will not fail you." By noon the sky turned hard blue, and the yard glittered. He tucked a deed copy under his shirt, the paper riding the same arm as the wolf, then hung the locket back around Lila's neck and tied the ribbon securely. They ate again in quiet bite. Nora leaned against his sleeve and slept with the clean trust of someone finally safe. He watched the door, the window, and the ridgeline, and felt a calm take root. He had lived by retreat for years. Now every line he drew pointed forward toward Bitterroot, toward Amos, toward a room where a claim could harden into protection. Outside, the mountains kept their counsel. Inside, Elias began to hold his, and for the first time in years the future felt possible. By noon, the ridge shone like heaven silver, and the path Margaret's runner took toward Bitterroot cut a pencil line through the wide white. Elias kept the door barred, the stove fed, and the twins close, listening between gusts for any sound that did not belong. When they woke from a short rest, he warmed stew and asked gently what had carried them so far. Lila answered first. Fever had taken their mother slowly, then fast. Clara Reed sold what she could, paid a wagoner to haul them to the rail, and pressed a brass locket into Lila's hand with a whisper. "Find the man with a wolf on his arm." Nora added pieces. Nights under tarps, a porch where a woman handed bread, a preacher who named a ridge with 3 stone teeth and said follow that. Elias listened without interruption. The papers in the locket did more than point to land. Behind the deed lay a folded letter, in Clara's hand, with a mark only he and she would recognize, a tiny scratch under a date tied to a night during the war, when a convoy vanished, and 3 souls slipped through cottonwoods because somebody turned a lantern the other way. It did not accuse, it asked. Please bring them to safety. Trust will have kept its shape. He shut the locket and set it beside the rifle, feeling something heavy shift inside his ribs from guilt toward use. Bitterroot learned fast. Before Reverend Amos Cole could leave the parsonage, a storekeeper's niece carried word home, and a ranch hand repeated it, over coffee. By sundown, men stood under the saloon eaves saying the name Clara Reed in voices that could bless or ruin. Some remembered a widow who paid bills on time. Others recalled a survey map showing veins under creek beds east of town. Victor Crane's company High Granite had eyed that ground and smiled the way men smile at unguarded bread. News that Clara's heirs had found shelter above the valley slid through alleys, rode under hats, and reached the boarding house where 2 of Crane's riders ate late. They set their cups down, left coins on the table, and took the back door. Inside the cabin, the girls learned small tasks, and with each task, their fear loosened a notch. Elias showed them how to string socks above the stove, how to fold blankets tightly so warmth would not escape, how to hold tin to steam and let breath return slowly. Lila asked if the wolf had a name. He told them no because the ink meant a promise rather than a companion. Between lessons they napped, and while they slept, he copied the deed in a neat hand, then tucked 1 copy behind a loose board, and another into a case Reverend Cole could seal. Margaret returned near dusk, shawl glittering with ice, and set bread on the table. She paused, head turned toward the door. Elias had heard nothing, yet the hair on his forearms rose. The room went still, wind scraped the roof. Beneath it, a faint crunch came. Wait. He stepped to the rifle, and kept it low. Margaret's eyes met his, steady and calm. Not yet, she mouthed. The sound moved past the shutter, paused by the stacked wood, then trailed off toward the trees. Elias counted to 50, then eased the door open. The cold cut his lungs. Tracks curved around the chopping block, 2 different boot patterns. He shut the door and banked the stove. Crane's men are out early, Margaret said. They asked at the clinic about frostbite and looked past my shoulder while I answered. Elias cleaned the rifle and set it near, not because he wanted a fight, but because the sight of it might buy time. He taught Lila and Nora a night drill. If he said their names twice, they would step behind the chimney stones, hold the quilt like a wall and keep their eyes on his back. They ate while Margaret brewed willow bark tea. Amos will come at first light, she said. He will stamp a copy here and carry another to the rectory safe. The twins listened like apprentices at a forge. After supper, the girls asked about their mother's garden. He told them what he remembered: beans, corn, a fence plaited with willow, jars bright as summer on a winter shelf. Lila said Clara had dreamed of planting again when the snow ended. Nora added that their mother kept a notebook full of soil notes and names of neighbors who traded seed. Elias guided them to the bench and tucked the robe high. When they slept, he opened the locket again and unfolded the tiny scrap he had not yet read. Clara had written a name under the line about trust, a name he had not heard since a river ferry ran dark, his own. Whispers spun like snow devils. Some argued the girls should go into town under official care. Others warned that the clerk owed Crane favors and would smile while losing documents behind a desk. A pair of ranchers offered wagons for an escort that would show strength and draw fire. Margaret's runner brought a better thread. Amos would ride the ridge path and come quietly. Elias set a second watch past midnight. The fire burned to coals. Frost feathered the inner pane. Outside, something brushed the gate. A low murmur followed. The sound of a man telling another man to wait. He let the seconds climb, then clapped once as if rousing a sleepy house. The voices vanished. Gray morning brought Amos, shoulders dusted with frost, seal wrapped in wool at his vest. He hugged the girls and read the deed aloud in a voice that turned parchment into protection. He pressed his seal on the copy, wrote a line certifying that the original would be presented to the council, and tucked both sheets into a wooden case. "Keep faith with quiet and do not open to every knock," he said. Amos said a small prayer for strength enough to keep small lives unharmed. Lila slid closer to Elias while the words lifted, and Nora touched the case as if blessing it back. In that quiet, a thought rose clean and unforced. Who in your life needs a shield? Elias was becoming theirs. After Amos left, the day held a brittle calm. A glint on the far bank told Elias that eyes still measured distance from cover. He kept the girls busy with letters and listened for the slightest wrong sound. Near afternoon, a crow lifted from the ridge with a harsh note. Margaret lifted her head the way she had the night before. Elias touched the rifle and nodded. The game had entered its next move. Crane had names now and the patience of a man who believed the world yielded to coin. What he did not have, Elias told himself, was these children. He watched the pines shiver and felt the old road narrow to a point where one choice remained. He would hold here, bring the claim to council, and meet whatever walked out of those trees with a straight back and a clear voice. Stay ready. Hoofbeats climbed the ridge at noon. Elias heard them while teaching Lila and Nora to fold the quilt tightly. He pressed a finger to his lips, guided the twins behind the chimney stones, and opened the door before any knock. 2 riders waited in the clearing, coats too clean. One had a scar on his mouth. "Mr. Kane," he said. "Victor Crane sends regards." The other lifted a pouch so the weight inside could be heard. "We represent High Granite. A creek parcel east of Bitterroot stands tangled by grief. Cash now, ink later. Winter presses. Children need food. Let us handle the matter." "The land is not mine," Elias said. "The heirs live." Scar Mouth kept smiling, eyes narrowing. "Orphans do not read ledgers. Paper confuses steady minds. Show us the deed, and we will fix mistakes." "There will be no papers for you," Elias answered. "Tell Crane the girls will keep what is theirs. Think, this is mercy." "Ride down," Elias said. "Return only with the council." His hand rested near the rifle by the jamb. "Law belongs to those who can hold it," Scarmouth said. "We will see which of us can." They turned and left, promising a return. Inside, the twins stepped out and stood very still. Nora's lips shook. Lila pressed her sister's hand flat. "Will they take Mama's land?" Nora asked. "No," Elias said. "They will try, and we will be ready." He crouched to eye level. "You heard what he said about the law. That is why we will learn how to hold what matters." He poured water and began lessons. He showed flint and steel, sparks and moss, warmth without burns. He taught wind in pine, quiet steps on plank edges, a whistle under the tongue. He gave a hand sign for hide, and another for still. By dusk they could vanish behind the hearth in a heartbeat. Margaret arrived with Reverend Amos. They were at the clinic, she said. 2 well-dressed strangers asked for frost salves, and studied the ledger. Amos warmed his hands. "I brought another stamp and a safe route. While Crane writes, we will write clearly." Elias described the visit and the pouch. Margaret slid a folded sheet across the table. "From the record office." I watched through the glass. The clerk opened a new book with last year's look and tried to slip it under the register. The first page claims Clara Reed transferred the land to High Granite in midsummer. Old form. Broken seal. He hid it when he saw me. Amos read, jaw tight. "Crane plans to drown truth in paper," he said. "We will carry it high." While the girls dozed, they set tasks. Amos would speak in the square at first light. Margaret would bring neighbors to the hall. Elias would watch the tree line and refuse any knock after dark. He sat by the door thinking of Clara's letter and the scratch beneath its date. At dawn, Amos rode down with sealed copies, and word ran ahead. Bitterroot woke to talk that split like water against rock. The saloon said wages mattered more than strangers' claim. The feed store owner asked how long a town should bow to a smiling debtor. By noon the men from the ridge returned with 3 more. They stopped at the gate, reins loose, hats polite. Scarmouth raised both hands. "We are not here to harm," he called. Our offer grew. He lifted a heavier pouch. The second man held an envelope thick with letters, cash, attorney notes, and a promise that no one will bother you again. Sign now, and teams will move furniture before nightfall. The children will sleep warm and never want. Elias stood on the porch with his back to the door. No, he said. You will not buy grief. You will not take what Clara meant for her daughters. Bring your lawyers to the hall. Speak openly. We have copies stamped by a man the town trusts. Scarmouth tried a softer angle. Men like Crane build roads and bring doctors, he said. Wild places also keep people honest. Elias answered. Leave. The men held their ground. A thin wind cut through the yard. One rider rested a hand near his coat. Elias kept his own hands open. Do not, he said. A mistake here will follow you down. At last they turned. One looked back with a hard stare that made a promise without words. Horses stepped away slowly and sure, tails lifting frost. When they were gone, Elias exhaled. Nora leaned against the jamb and wiped her cheek. They sounded like teachers who are angry, she said. They did, he answered. But we choose our teachers. After lunch he set more drill. The twins learned to track a single boot print among deer marks. To see where snow settled differently on a stump that hid a man's weight. To count to 50 while fear screamed, and then breathe like the fire. Lila copied a map with careful lines. Nora packed the locket so it would not click. Margaret returned with news. The council meets tomorrow, she said. Half the town will come. Some want peace at any price. Some say children matter more than payroll. A few wait to see who wins. She set 3 names on the table who would speak for justice, and 3 more who would choose Crane if fear rose. We need clear eyes in that hall, she said. We need neighbors willing to say no. Elias walked the line at dusk and found fresh prints by the chopping block. Someone had stood there long enough to smoke 2 cigarettes. The cabin felt watched. He slid whistles under small pillows and checked the loose board. As night gathered, he spoke to the twins in a voice that kept fear small. What do we do if someone pounds the door, he asked. Hide behind the chimney and keep an eye on you, they answered. If a window breaks, down behind the table legs, faces away from the glass. If I say your names twice, stay still. He smiled. Skill makes sleep easy. Beyond the ridge a branch cracked, and silence deepened. Amos sent a note. Deputies would stand at the hall doors. The mayor pushed the matter to the end of the agenda. A trick used to thin a crowd. Margaret read and laughed without humor. He thinks late hour makes weak wills, she said. We will keep people in their seats. Elias touched the locket, then the wolf on his arm, then the girls' heads under the robe. Firelight washed their faces with quiet gold. His voice, when it came, was meant for any soul listening in that cold. When greed threatens what's right, will you stand firm like Elias? He asked softly, asking the room to answer. Near midnight, a shadow crossed the window and paused. Elias held his breath and counted. The shape bent and left. He sat by the door with the rifle across his knees, ready for morning. Down in Bitterroot, lamps burned while men argued, and Crane's car was said to be moving toward town with fresh smiles and thicker envelopes. Snow thickened until the ridge lay white and listening. Elias stacked wood, checked the bar, and ran Lila and Nora through one last drill. Margaret had gone to the clinic. Reverend Amos promised to ring the bell at dawn. The cabin felt sealed. Then a new smell crawled under the door, lamp oil. He turned as a gloved fist punched the window. Smoke rolled in from a hissing can. The latch lifted. 2 men burst through. Elias caught Nora, the second wrapped Lila in a blanket, and drove a shoulder into his ribs. Boots pounded, runners scraped, hooves struck sparks. He fired once into the blur and hit nothing. A child cried, then silence. Then darkness. He ran anyway, knife out, then stopped, and listened. A coughing horse, a dragging jingle, 2 sleighs. He fixed those details in his mind and sprinted back. Margaret met him at the door with a lamp cupped low. She smothered the fire with a wet blanket, set a vinegar rag to Nora's mouth and looked at him. Dead Mule Gulch, she said. Crane moved winter shacks there. Elias slung a rope and lifted the rifle. We go now. At the switchback they found Amos with 2 ranchers and a deputy named Finch. The deputy pointed through the trees toward a notch where the wind made a horn. Sled track crosses the creek and comes up behind the camp, he said. Use that and you'll reach the sheds before a guard thinks. Amos squeezed Elias's shoulder. I'll pull. Eyes toward the water. Elias told Nora. Hold the locket. We're coming for your sister. Her jaw set like stone. They moved in a single file. Snow squeaked under boots. Every scrape felt loud as a shout. The sky wore a milk glow. Twice they stopped and let the wind speak. The third time, harness rings answered from ahead. Elias angled left to avoid a sweep of glare. A goat path cut down through scrub toward the shelf. He pointed. Finch nodded. Margaret drew a deep, quiet breath and went. A fox ghosted across the slope, tail low, and vanished in dwarf fur. Elias took it as a sign. Move with care. Leave no noise behind. The camp sat on a shelf above the creek. 2 rows of shacks facing a larger room beside stacked door. Hooded lanterns kept light close. A slim bell hung by the gate. 2 men walked a patient loop, stamping to wake numb feet. Elias watched their rhythm. 9 paces, turn, 6, look left, spit, count, 3, look right. At the spit, he slipped from rock to plank stack. A rope loop touched a guard's face and eased him backward into the fur. Finch slid the body behind sacks, then drifted away. Margaret hugged the porch with Nora's head under the shawl. Inside, a clerk with ink on his fingers stood behind a table stacked with forms. Lila kept near a stove, coat half-buttoned, chin lifted by stubborn will. Victor Crane stood behind the clerk, hat off, patience set like silver. We can resolve this confusion, the clerk said. A mark here grants care. The company assumes burdens unsuited to children, Lila said. Mama told us not to sell what keeps water clean. Crane's mouth barely moved. Mrs. Holt, he said as Margaret entered. Bring the girls under my letter. Structure protects. Margaret tied Lila's buttons. Put your pen down. Elias stepped in behind her with the rifle low. Nora saw him and swallowed a cry. Lila's shoulders dropped, then squared. Elias said, walk us to the gate. No one needs to die. Crane almost smiled. You plan to stroll through a camp that feeds 2 counties. I plan to take 2 children home, Elias said, without firing a shot. His eyes found a young miner at the jam with soot on one cheek and a crooked name tag. Jory Pike. Lila looked straight at him. Please, she said. Our mother's land is ours. Margaret added, quietly. Sometimes one brave choice changes everything. Elias made his. Jory took a breath like a grown-up stepping onto a sound plank. Sir, he told Crane. Let them go. Crane's eyes cooled. You anger me, you miss 2 weeks' pay. Jory shook his head. I need to meet my sister's eyes. He raised both hands. Hold your hands, boy. No trouble tonight. A second miner set his bucket down. A third peeled a scarf from his mouth. The clerk quietly closed his ledger. Elias backed them onto the porch. Finch drifted to cover the flank. Oliver Wade, a gray rancher with rope scars, waited by the fence with Eli. He lifted the latch. Amos rose near a log beyond the gate and melted into willows again. Lanterns painted thin gold. Trees kept night tight. Frost crackled on railings. Breath rose in white ropes and snapped in the wind. A brittle music that made every step feel counted. Crane stood in the doorway and made no move to ring the bell, as if calculating that a quiet loss hurt less than a noisy brawl. They walked. Jory stepped ahead, showing the path. No one shouted. Tools met boards as if the camp pretended more. At the willows, the world narrowed to breath and cold. The goat path kicked straight up a rock face glazed with blown powder. Oliver strung his rope across a bulge and braced his boots so each could palm the line and slide without falling. Finch broke a cornice with the butt of his gun. Snow dropped in a sheet and revealed safer stone. They climbed like people who knew the price of a slip. Halfway, Lila's legs shook. Elias lifted her against his chest. Her breath warmed his collar and steadied. Margaret set a pace meant for tired children. not men with something to prove. Above them, the ridge cut the sky into a hard seam. Behind, the camp turned to dim coins. No bell rang, only wind spoke. They topped the lip and crossed into the shelter. Pines grabbed at wool, then let go. Finch listened, then nodded. No pursuit yet. Jory's breath fogged wide. He will come to the hall and bluster, he said. Good, Margaret answered. Let neighbors see. They angled into timber where snow hung like soft bells. Bitter roots lamps smeared the far plain. Each step toward that glow lifted the weight Elias had carried for years. Nora tucked her hand inside his coat, as if returning something that belonged there. Lila touched the locket, and whispered that it had never clicked. Quiet is a skill, Elias said. She nodded against his sleeve. At the last rise before the valley, Elias looked back. A single figure stood by the big room, coat vents lifting like cut wings. Even from here, Crane looked pale, watching a coin roll under a floorboard. None of that mattered now. The girls were warm, the night held, and the road to the bell lay clear. Amos put a hand on Elias's shoulder. Straight to the hall, he said. Truth on the table before rumor can dress. Elias adjusted Lila higher. Her small hand pressed the wolf on his sleeve as if sealing a pact. They turned downhill, careful to carry everything into the morning. Dawn bled across Bitterroot while pines shook off rime and the chapel bell tolled 3 slow notes. Elias Kane reached the last rise with Lila on his hip, and Nora gripping his coat, Margaret Holt steadying their steps, Deputy Finch and Oliver Wade covering the rear, and Jory Pike walking ahead with his hands visible, a man who had crossed a line he could not uncross. Lamps woke in windows as townsfolk spotted 2 small figures beside a bearded stranger who looked as if winter had carved him from spruce. When they stepped from the timber into the square, talk thinned to breath and boot scrape. Reverend Amos Cole waved them toward the council hall. Warm first, then paper, he said, voice calm and ringing. Inside, Margaret sat the girls by a stove. Unlaced boots, peeled damp socks and tucked blankets high. Nora leaned into Elias without asking permission. Lila kept one hand on the brass locket and the other on his sleeve until her breathing steadied. Amos set a table near the front and laid out ink, a sand shaker and his seal. The mayor drifted in with 2 council members followed by ranchers, storekeepers, a school teacher and 3 miners, who smelled of lamp oil. Victor Crane did not appear, yet his foreman with the scarred mouth did, and the records clerk hovered near the door with eyes that avoided light. Margaret spread her clean copy of Clara Reed's deed for all to see. This matches the original she carried, she said. Creek and meadow east of town surveyed properly. Murmurs braided through the room like smoke in rafters. Clarity cures rumor, he said. He lifted the locket from Lila's palm, found the tiny catch hidden along the rim, and pressed. A second door sprang. From that thin space he drew a folded paper sealed with wax and Clara's steady name. Clara placed her deed inside her daughter's guard, he announced. He broke the seal, read the metes and bounds, read the date, then set the sheet beside Margaret's copy so eyes could travel between them. Same oak stump marker, same surveyor's hand. The holder is Clara Reed, to pass to Lila Reed and Nora Reed upon her death. No one spoke for a breath that felt as long as a season. Scarmouth cleared his throat. High granite holds a transfer, he said. Margaret faced him without moving her feet. From a Clarissa Reed with a broken stamp and last year's ledger slipped into a new book, she answered. She pulled a rubbing from her satchel, black lines matching the clerk's neat scratches. You slid counterfeit pages across a desk and hoped frost would dull our eyes. Chairs scraped. Men leaned forward. The school teacher removed spectacles and polished them as if polishing truth. Jory spoke from the wall. Crane ordered pressure and offered coin, he said. He told the camp to hold the girls until papers bled clean. They would not yield. I would not either. He looked at Elias as if asking permission to stand inside that statement. Elias gave one slow nod. Finch stepped forward. I have 2 names who watched the forgery and 3 who guarded the shacks, he said. Call them and they will talk. Heads turned to the mayor. He swallowed and nodded once. Nora tugged Elias's sleeve. Are we safe? She whispered. He crouched to her height. Safer than yesterday, he said. Lila passed the locket back to Amos with both palms. Mama hid 2 doors. she whispered. She counted on us not to panic. Amos returned the locket to her neck and smiled the kind of smile that gives spine to small shoulder. A woman near the stove cried into her glove. A rancher murmured that some people still knew how to plan for wolves. Amos stamped Margaret's copy, then wrote a line certifying the locket's interior matched the public record, and signed beneath it. The mayor added his name with a careful hand. This council recognizes Lila Reed and Nora Reed as rightful heirs, he declared. Any claim by High Granite is stayed pending territorial review, and the constable will seal the record office now. Scarmouth opened his mouth, closed it, and left without looking right or left. The clerk followed with his hat crushed in both hands. Margaret poured broth and set bread by the small bowls. Elias watched the girls eat, and an ache rose that was not panic, not rage, something older, a fear that he would ruin what needed care. He had left men to fates he still tasted in sleep. He had run from Clara's eyes when he believed his presence brought harm. Now 2 children leaned into his ribs and called him running over. He wiped snow from his beard and accepted the weight. Unworthy did not mean unable. He could learn the work. Hooves clattered outside, then faded north. By late afternoon word blew back that winter shacks at Dead Mule Gulch stood empty, stoves cold, bunks stripped, ledgers torn, bell rope cut. Crane had fled toward the rail spur with a trunk and a story. Jory rolled his blankets and set them in Oliver's wagon, a man starting clean without swagger. I will make amends with sweat, he told Elias. Start at the school site, put posts in that hold. Elias shook his hand once, brief and firm. Do that, he said. Bring your sister when spring loosens the road. Neighbors brought quilts, jars, pencils, and quiet promises. A seamstress offered to mend the ribbons so the locket would never fray. A rancher's wife pressed boots into Nora's arms that would fit by spring. Finch posted 2 steady men at the hall doors over. The mayor and Amos walked to the rectory, signed a longer affidavit, and sent the constable to lock the record drawers. Margaret returned to the clinic and sent back salve, willow bark, and a note. Sleep in shifts. No visitors after sundown. Send for her if coughing returns. As evening settled, the square turned amber. Will you stay when the drifts melt? Nora asked. He measured his answer. I will stay today, he said. Tomorrow too. After that, I will choose the same answer until it is the only one I know. That works, she murmured. Mama said good men keep showing up. They bedded down in a small back room where quilts smelled of cedar and flower. Doubt crawled close and asked old questions about worthiness and endings. He let it talk until it tired. Before dawn he woke to find Nora's hand tucked inside his coat, and Lila's cheek pressed to his sleeve. Something eased, not because the burden vanished, but because the purpose no longer wavered. He stood, stoked the stove, and stepped into the square. Bitter roots smelled of ash, yeast, and clean cold. Beyond the ridge, cranes of another kind would return in spring. For now, the town had decided that 2 small girls mattered more than a ledger. Elias touched the locket's warm curve at Lila's throat, and the wolf on his arm, and felt both marks settle into one promise. Morning settled over Bitterroot in a thin band of pearl that lifted frost from hitch rails and sharpened the rooflines around the square. The council hall stove breathed steady heat. The air smelled of wool and ink, and benches held neighbors who had refused sleep. Elias Kane sat near the front with Lila and Nora between him and Margaret Holt. Reverend Amos Cole arranged documents beside the mayor, spectacles low on his nose. Copies of Clara Reed's deed lay on the table, sanded dry, edges square, signatures clear, ready for the vote that would decide guardians and future. Amos rose and read the metes and bounds aloud, so everyone had the same map. He lifted the brass locket, worked the hidden catch, and drew out the second compartment sealed beneath the portrait. Wax broke with a crisp snap. He compared signatures, stamps, and the surveyor's looping hand, then pointed to the oak stump marker and the crooked bend of the creek that no storm could move. This claim belongs to Lila Reed and Nora Reed, he said. Until they come of age, this town will hold it in trust and keep water, soil, timber, and access safe from purchase, threat, or trickery. Neighbors exhaled together. Oliver Wade stood and offered posts and rails from his yard. The blacksmith promised fittings at cost. The school teacher pledged lessons without fee until taxes caught up. A baker slid a warm loaf onto the sill. Margaret set her palms gently on the girl's shoulders, grounding them without words. The council wrote a charter, and ordered 3 copies. Finch posted deputies at the door, and sent a runner to confirm the record drawers remained sealed. Scarred mouth Crane's foreman hesitated at the threshold long enough to hear every point, then slipped away when he understood leverage had vanished. Amos drafted guardianship papers in neat strokes and read each clause to Elias, pausing whenever language carried duty, shelter, food, schooling, protection, prudent management of assets, and inspection by the council if neglect were alleged. Elias breathed once, then signed where the ink waited, handwriting firm and unadorned. He pressed the seal into warm wax and watched the impression hold. Margaret added her commitment as a supporting caregiver, clinic visits, herb lessons, mending and school coordination. Amos signed as spiritual overseer, promising counsel and watchfulness. Lila and Nora gripped the table edge and grinned through relief so wide it looked like sunlight after weeks of gray. Word reached the hall by noon that Victor Crane had boarded a coach east with a trunk strapped tight, and a letter, blaming weather, sickness and unreliable locals. The clerk who had abetted forgery packed a carpetbag and vanished by dusk. No one cheered. Bitterroot returned to chores as if decency were ordinary business, because it was. Elias, Margaret and Amos walked the ridge path to Clara's parcel with the twins, while the deed copy rode inside Elias's coat above the wolf tattoo. The creek hummed under a white lid. Frost traced last summer's rose. A collapsed trellis leaned like a broken harp beside sleeping earth. They made a plan using short sentences, not speeches. Oliver would deliver posts when the ground thawed. Jory Pike, newly hired by the school, would dig holes and brace corners. The twins would paint signs for rows and carry water from the bend in small buckets. Margaret would swap tinctures for seed and teach simple remedies for scrapes. Amos would organize neighbors to raise a tool shed so shovels stayed dry. Elias would turn soil every afternoon until blisters quieted. The girls would sleep at the clinic for 3 nights while smoke cleared from their clothes and nightmares loosened their grip. Winter leaned back. Days lengthened, snow sank inch by inch. When earth released its first smell, the town arrived with spades and easy laughter. Children raked, mothers folded compost into tired dirt. Men levered rocks from furrows and rolled them aside. Elias shaved, his heavy beard falling like a curtain, revealing a face shaped more by listening than defense. He kept the wolf not as a hiding place, but as a promise to act. Lila set bean seeds in pairs. Nora pressed corn into hills and patted each mound as if blessing tomorrow. Green came gradually and then quickly, shoots pricked the surface, leaves unfurled, vines found twine and climbed. Lila learned to mulch around roots, to tie loose loops that would not choke stems, to pick beans at dawn when pods snapped clean. Nora learned to stake before storms, to read sky colors at evening, to set basins under eaves when rain offered extra. Margaret steeped yarrow for fevers and pressed calendula into salve. Amos hoed beside neighbors and told short parables about burdens shared, truth spoken even when coin whispers otherwise. Elias's change ran like a thaw through the spring. He laughed without surprise when Nora's joke landed, and he listened without glancing at the doors while Lila read from a primer by lamplight. He slept better, shame still visited, yet it no longer chose his chair. Work answered questions. Talk could. He had signed a line that asked for daily faithfulness. Giving that labor felt like breath finally clearing after smoke. Sometimes he paused at the fence and watched the twins weed in companionable quiet, learning how care moves without speeches. By midsummer, beans hung like curtains and corn brushed his shoulder. The town gathered for a small blessing at dusk. Margaret ladled stew while children ran around the new fence. Amos lifted a hand, thankful without flourish. He praised a widow's foresight, a community's resolve, and a man who stepped forward where he once stepped aside. He did not mention Victor Crane. He named steadfastness and neighborliness, then asked a question that moved like wind across grass. When your street calls for steady hands, will you answer together? The line drifted outward and settled into quiet hearts like a seed finding tilled ground. Practical tasks continued after the bowls were washed. The charter designated the parcel as community protected until the majority barred sale of water rights, limited timber cutting to replanted rows, and directed a portion of surplus to the school pantry each autumn. Sealed copies lived at the rectory, The council office, in the circuit court. Finch swore an oath over the box. The mayor set a cedar plaque on a post. Clara's garden, tended by Bitterroot, kept for Lila and Nora. The girls traced the carved letters with serious fingers and stood a little taller, as if the wood itself had given them back breath they had been holding. Evening cooled the ridge. Stars spread across a black bowl so clear that breath felt like prayer, whether or not lips moved. Elias walked the path home with the twins between him and Margaret, while Amos followed, humming a hymn under his breath. The creek no longer hid, it clattered over stones. The locket rested at Lila's throat. The deed stayed where the law could find it. On the porch, Elias untied Nora's boots and listened to her questions fade. Lila leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "We are home." He answered, "We are," and truly believed it, not as a boast, but as a vow kept at last. Spring loosened the valley until snow peeled back from the Wind River foothills, and the creek ran glassy, quick and talkative. Elias Kane walked the garden lines with Clara's old trowel, showing Lila and Nora how to firm soil around seedlings using cupped palms, not fists, because tenderness sets roots deeper than force. Clean-shaven skin caught the sun. Sometimes his hand still rose toward absent whiskers, and both girls laughed hard enough to send birds fluttering from the fence. He laughed too, and let the gesture fade, pleased that his face matched the life he meant to keep. Along the boundary, posts stood straight, rails oiled and tools hung where small hands could find them without searching or worry. Work fell into rhythm. At dawn he simmered porridge while steam fogged the small panes, pinched mint into bowls, and laid tin cups like bright punctuation. After breakfast, they walked the fence, tested knots, checked the cold frame, lifted slugs from young beans, and set them gently beyond rows. He taught a bite test for seed dryness. They taught tricks for coaxing ladybirds onto thistle. Margaret Holt arrived with a basket and pencil, checking knees, counting breaths, sketching planting grids, and tucking willow bark beside the salt. Afternoon meant quiet reading, then chores, then a stroll to the creek where stones warmed bare feet, and water braided light into their shadows. Evenings ended with lists for tomorrow and a lamp turned low. Wyoming widened as if the landscape approved their pace. Bluebirds stitched the fence line with color. A fox slipped through bunchgrass at dusk, glancing over a shoulder the way confident neighbors do. High above, eagles rode thermals, until wings took a sheet of gold, then folded into hard blue without strain. Wind dropped from circus with the astringent scent of late drifts, threading the pines with music that made conversation quiet itself. Elias read that wind the way he once read tracks, except now, every sign led toward tending rather than retreat. He felt guilt loosen, not because memory faded, but because daily care left no room for waste. Bitterroot matched their steadiness. Jory Pike hauled lumber from Oliver Wade's yard and squared footings along the garden's north edge for a schoolhouse that would honor Clara. Reverend Amos Cole moved jars to the counter, gathering coins and notes, persuading the guild to lend benches and the blacksmith to fit iron pegs at cost. The council granted a sliver of the parcel for learning and ordered windows cut toward the creek, so children could learn to read and memorize the sound of the creek alongside consonants. Neighbors pledged nails, window latches and chalk. The plan grew plain: a room with light, a bell with tone, a door that stayed open, lessons shared without boasting. Elias rebuilt the trellis using bent willow and stout spruce, favoring curved strength over brittle angle. He showed Lila where to bury fish scraps beneath corn hills, a secret nourishment that did not require boasting. Nora labeled seed envelopes with neat round letters and tucked them into a carved box with an acorn on the lid. After supper, the twins took turns reading by lamplight while he planned rails smooth enough for small hands. Margaret brewed yarrow for sleep and calendula for scratches, reminded them to drink water, and praised quiet persistence as the bravest kind of courage. Night closed without dread. Morning waited without noise. Rafters rose under quiet hammers. Nora balanced on a plank, handing dowels to Elias who set pegs and checked lines. Lila leaned against a post, choosing colors for a mural that would climb around the chalkboard like vines. wildflowers curling around the sentence her mother offered during lean seasons. Plant where water remembers you. Amos promised cedar letters for the gable and returned with a plaque already oiled. When neighbors slid the ridge beam into pockets, a hush followed, as if the hill itself approved. The bell arrived wrapped in burlap. Jory polished it until it caught the sky and started ringing without moving. Classes began the week the hills turned gold. Children ran their hands over desks, fragrant with new planed grain, and learned the prickly music of chalk on slate. Lila sat near the breeze and light, flew through sums, then traced rivers on the wall map like someone greeting cousins. Nora filled margins with sketches of hands holding tools, boots planted on slopes, faces bent toward honest tasks. Margaret taught mornings, the new school teacher afternoons, Amos on Thursdays, and Elias whenever work answered the lesson better than taught. At dismissal, the twins carried books home, wrapped in cloth, and returned the next day with neat pages and proud smudges. Winter came trimmed and clean. Smoke rose straight instead of clinging. The creek sang under ice like wire brushed by practiced fingers. Elias kept his whiskers close cropped, a ritual that said renewal requires tending. He read poems slowly beside the stove, stumbled, corrected, laughed, and tried again until words slid without fear. The girls added refrains, voices answering one another like meadow larks across fence posts. Sundays meant chapel, then a long walk along the boundary to check posts. Gratefully simple, snow softened ruts, and the schoolhouse lantern glowed like a harbor light above sleeping road. One moonlit night, frost jeweled every dead stem while silence expanded, until boot scuffs felt wrong to spoil it. Elias set chairs outside and wrapped quilts around narrow shoulders. They watched fox tracks appear near the fence before vanishing into the brush, proof that safety often looks like smart routes. Stars pooled like seeds scattered from a careful hand. Nora found Orion and named each star with delighted accuracy. Lila whispered that the garden slept the way music rests between measures, breathing on purpose, not from fear. He nodded, grateful to learn metaphors from children who had walked through weather and chosen warmth. Spring returned, carrying braver green. Shoots shouldered through mulch. Bees drifted over mint. The rose Clara once tied with twine opened. Lila looped a ribbon near that blossom and set a bowl of water at the base. Nora sketched the curve, shading patiently, then wrote her mother's name under the drawing without tears. The schoolhouse bell gathered morning light and scattered it through the doorway. Children lined up for tours, left with seed paper, and were promised to report sprouts. Elias leaned on the fence, traced the wolf with a thumb, and rested his palm on cedar carved with Clara's name. He finally believed tomorrow could hold something gentle and earned. Twilight folded across Bitterroot, like a soft quilt. The creek spoke in silver. The new schoolhouse windows held the day's last gold, and Clara's garden lifted a cool breath after watering. Elias Kane sat on the porch with Lila tucked under his right arm and Nora leaning against his left, both quiet after chores and lessons. Fireflies rose from bean vines and corn tassels like patient stars learning to walk. The cedar plaque by the gate caught the dim and returned a gleam. Clara's garden, tended by Bitterroot, kept for Lila and Nora. Elias reread the words. They felt steady. He squeezed shoulders and listened as crickets stitched the hedges while the bell rope clicked once in a breeze. Before supper, the town gathered for a brief ceremony. Neighbors tied a bright ribbon along the plaque and read a proclamation honoring Clara's courage, foresight, and stubborn kindness. Children from the class shared lines about water, seed, and mornings when hope seems thin until work begins. Jory Pike rang the bell once, then stepped back with damp eyes. Oliver Wade traced the carved letters with a rough thumb and promised the fence would hold if good hands kept passing care forward. Margaret Holt offered a blessing for sound sleep and a steady harvest. Reverend Amos Cole spoke last, reminding everyone that guardianship is a daily craft. Applause rose, then faded into talk, and pots began to simmer across the square. Later, the warmth of the gathering lingered like an ember. Lila counted fireflies until numbers failed and wonder took over. Nora cupped one flicker beneath her hand, felt the tickle of wings, then lifted her palm and let the lantern rise into dusk. Elias watched both faces move from solemn to bright and back again. Margaret returned with a folded page. "Council minutes," she said. "The charter stands. Water stays public. Timber rotation stays strict. Any sale after the majority needs a community review. Amos nodded. Record, witness, and daily work will keep this ground safe. Lila touched the ribbon and whispered that her mother would have liked the words and the way the town spoke them. She smiled and squeezed his hand. They ate cornbread and berries at the porch table while the garden breathed an incredible scent of damp soil. The schoolhouse lantern made a small circle on the path showing scuffs where children had lined up and one scratched star. Someone would polish tomorrow. A coyote called, then fell quiet. Margaret gathered plates and lingered, eyes on the twins with a look that mixed pride and a healer's habit of counting pulse and color. Amos placed a small journal beside Elias. For new seasons, he said, write what you plant, what grows, who comes. Nora opened it like a gift. Lila wrote the date with care. Elias added, we sat together and watched fireflies over Clara's rose, grateful to belong. Night deepened. The mountains shaped the sky into a black bowl scattered with cold sparks. A breeze slipped from the cirque and combed the corn tips with a whisper. Elias drew the girls closer and let memory pass without owning him. He remembered the first knock in a storm, the smoke pushed through the glass, the run along the creek, the bell, the hall, the ink, the seal, and the trembling hands pressed into his coat at dawn. He remembered the foreman's thin smile, the moment Jory chose conscience over fear, the council vote, the charter, and the day the rose opened on Clara's cane. Those scenes no longer ruled him, they taught instead. Like markers set along a trail to work, the twins told him about Clara. Nora had drawn hands holding tools along the blackboard border, each pair different, each grip steady. Lila had solved a hard sum by seeing cornhills as tall columns that add themselves when rain keeps faith. Margaret described a lesson on river crossings and edible plants near the ridge. Amos mentioned a family passing through who needed a hot meal and found more than that. Every detail felt small and right, the kind of rhythm that builds a life without noise. Fireflies kept climbing and dimming, spelling patient sentences he could almost read if he slowed his breathing enough to match their quiet pace. The creek answered with steady music beneath the porch board. Elias lifted cups, fetched hot tea, and returned with a slice of pie Margaret had saved for this watch. He ate without hurry, letting flavor and quiet mingle. For years he had chased storms, run from voices, and told the sky he would not harm anyone by staying away. Then 2 children crossed winter with Clara's locket and asked him to try again. He had done so, step by step, with help given and help accepted. Peace arrived in ordinary clothes, sitting beside him with warm shoulders and even breath. He did not deserve it more than others. He did the work. That seemed the point. He passed the last bite to Nora, who smiled without lifting her head. Music drifted from a neighbor's porch, a fiddle line crossing the square like a thin thread that mended the day. Lila hummed, then set her head against his forearm. Nora traced the tattoo, and asked whether the marks could change. They can, Elias said. A sign becomes what you do with it. Margaret squeezed his shoulder and carried dishes inside. Amos tapped the rail and smiled. Rest, he said. Tomorrow we raise the little bridge and hang window trim, hands steady, minds clear. He tipped his hat and walked toward the rectory. The twins yawned together, opening like new leaves. Elias told a short tale about a fox who crossed the ice by listening to the river song. The porch boards creaked once. The night smelled of pine, mint, wood smoke, and wet earth. The ribbon fluttered once and went still. The bell darkened into a quiet moon above clean board. Elias looked over the path toward shadowed rows and felt that a particular morning would arrive exactly when needed. He had found a place to stand, a family to hold, a town willing to keep faith, and work that would outlast any single pair of hands. Hardship had not vanished. It had found company. Where fear once kept him small, duty now kept him present, and love made that duty light enough to carry. He would show up, plant, teach, learn, and keep watch, repeating those verbs until they shaped every day he had left. Lila lifted the journal. What should we add? She asked. Write about the plaque, Nora said, and the bell, and Margaret's lesson on currents, and Amos asking us to notice kindness that costs something. Elias nodded. Write that the garden remembered water and that we remembered to show up. Fireflies floated higher, then lower, tracing a language of pauses and returns. The creek answered with its line. Elias drew a breath and spoke to the girls, to the yard, To anyone listening on a distant road, stories like these remind us of the power of second chance. Subscribe to hear a new tale tomorrow. Don't miss what happens next. Come back, watch fireflies rise and carry light wherever your road bends.